Let's maybe start it off as a brief introduction. My name is Tobias. I'm interviewing Nikola, who's an esteemed podcaster and blogger in the field of singularity and artificial intelligence research. I'm reading your blog since a couple of months by now, and I'm very impressed by your work. Thanks a lot for your time, and great that you're available for a chat.
And my pleasure, and of course, I'm very happy to be joining you and trying to see what I can do and help you do your research in the best way possible I can.
Thanks so much. I just used the time prior to our interview to browse a little bit again your podcast archive. It's a remarkable collection of people that you spoke with in the past, so it's definitely my honor to have you on the other side of the continent, of the world, in the line. It's a great pleasure. Briefly about the flow, I would suggest the following. I submitted you a couple of questions up front. I would give you a brief introduction into the topic that I've been working on during the past couple of months, sort of a pitch about the science that I've been dealing with. And afterwards, I would suggest that we open the discussion a little bit about a couple of aspects of singularity that I've came across and where I would be grateful to hear your feedback.
Sure, of course.
Sounds good. Briefly about this background about this research that I was working on. About 3 years, I was returning from the States, where I've been working with internet startups. And I returned to a rather rural area in Germany where I all of a sudden encountered questions by members of my family, by old working colleagues. And they were all asking me, what did you do there? And I started explaining about internet applications, about these apps. It was like the early days of the startup trend. And I figured that explaining internet applications is actually to people like my mom or to my grandmother or to my small nephew was incredibly complicated, because you basically had to explain each and every type of internet service that we can imagine in a different way. And while observing this learning process of these people, I figured that language, in a way, is the most important tool in communication, because the way we comprehend something by our wordings, by the semantics that we're using, is like the closest connection point eventually to the consciousness, to the understanding of people. And what I figured by doing so is how every kind of internet application can be explained by who else. And this sounds funny, but it works very nicely. It's like ride sharing, who else, dating, who else, food sharing, who else, apartment sharing, who else is in this building, who else is in Berlin, who else can drive my car, who else turned out to be something like a children's language in order to explain the internet. And I took this as a reason to look deeper into the topic of language, of the history of technology interfaces. And I got kind of fascinated by it, because if we consider that Tim Berners-Lee 27 years ago, he was basically inventing the hypertext protocol, like the namespace protocol for internet applications. But he was doing it at a point where we didn't actually know what we could use the internet for. And if we look further back into the history of technologies, we know from Alexander Graham Bell that the telephone ringer had to be invented. Previously, people were shouting like ahoy into the phone line because they didn't know how to notify each other. And during the past couple of years, like the past 15 years just about, when we started with social media, we certainly made some kind of advancements in the area of how do we use technologies in a standardized way. If you think about the Facebook like button or like the upvotes on YouTube. But I think that I figured that this who else semantic is a way to create a new kind of namespace, like internet explained in children's language. And what started as like an ethnographic observation turned more and more into research about singularity and AI, and how far semantics relates to this topic of creating intelligent systems. And while conducting this research, I arrived at the point where I think that I can make the hypothesis that if children are better able to understand the internet by using the semantic of who else, because it's like babies talk for the internet, what if machines would be trained to use this semantic of who else? Because if we imagine like this voice assistants of like Alexa from like Amazon, of like Google Siri, of Amazon, Google, of Apple Siri and Google's Now, all of the systems are at the moment at a point where they understand some kind of comments that you provides them with, but still they're lacking this kind of emotional intelligence that's necessary to interpret how like children are talking. And this is why I think that if we really want to talk about singularity in the next couple of years, where we still need to bridge this technology gap, that we need to start considering how should we talk with AI. And my hypothesis that I arrived with is that eventually an approach to foster artificial intelligence is that we start speaking with AI similar as we do with children. Because if babies understand computers better in children's language, maybe machines could better understand as well children if they would be trained in a children's language. And this is kind of this overall hypothesis that I've developed throughout this time. I'm curious, what is your experience in terms of natural language processing from the past couple of years? What are kind of maybe insights that you gained from this, I believe, over 200 interviews that you conducted? How did you perceive this idea? I'm curious for your general point of view.
So first of all, I think that theoretically speaking, it's a brilliant idea. It makes complete sense to me if we presume that there is such thing as universal grammar that spans across all languages and that is hardwired in our brains. It makes perfect sense, and that's how babies learn. It makes perfect sense to me to take this kind of a process and introduce it into our relationship with the machines and artificial intelligence. Now, language is very, very important, as we know, because everything happens in language, not necessarily. William Shakespeare said, "There's nothing good nor bad, but thinking makes it so," and we think in language. We reason, we logic, we do everything in language first. Even if it's in thought, our thoughts function in language before they happen in actuality. That's why the kind of language we're going to use to communicate and interact with machines, let alone advanced machines such as artificial intelligence, will be vitally important to the kind of relationship we may end up getting. And I mean, another way of approaching that and learn from is the Buddhist experience. Buddhism, for example, and Eastern philosophy in general, has a lot to say about the importance of language, and first making the distinction between the world of names, which is language, and the world of reality, which is of material things which exist outside of language. And language is therefore the sort of mirror image of, or the verbal representation of, but is not the real objects. And thus, if we start from different cultures, for example, the East and the West, we can see how there's very kind of interesting and rather different biases that each language carries, and there's consequently pros and cons to each of those approaches. Thus, it is very, very important what kind of language we're going to use to communicate and socialize with, or make progress with, and co-evolve with artificial intelligence. Why? Because our language would carry its inherent biases, would carry its certain kind of presumptions, if you will, and it's therefore crucial to be cognizant and aware of all those things, and be deliberate in choosing those when we're approaching our relationship with the AI. Now, if we are able to strip all of those biases away, and I'm not a linguist and I'm not specialist on Noam Chomsky's linguistics, but if we are able to strip those biases completely, and I'm not sure we can, but if we can, and we are able to use hardwired language that spans across all generations, ages, and cultures and languages, now that would be absolutely a fundamental accomplishment and a new foundation, a new basis to move forward. Actually, if I can remember, one person who has been calling for the creation of such a language has been Jacques Fresco. Jacques Fresco has been the major proponent of the Venus Project, and he hates vagueness. He hates lack of precision. He hates lack of accuracy. He wants everything to be perfectly measurable, scientific, and exactly accurate. Now, I'm not sure if we can go that far personally. And also, even if we could, I'm not sure if we should or we would, because one could argue that the richness of language and the adaptability of language, its ability to evolve forward as our requirements change, actually stems from that vagueness, stems from that kind of gray area. Because if everything is perfectly precise and accurate 100% of the time, how can we evolve? How can it ever be better? It would be dead and static. So there is a variety of issues involved in this, but to me personally, that's a long way of saying that the original foundational hypothesis that you start with is not only interesting, but brilliant and very much worth pursuing. Now, is the specific application of that general idea through the phrase of what else?
Who else?
Pardon?
Who else?
It's who else? Who else? I apologize. Through who else as one of the most popular phrases on the internet. Is that the best way to take that general idea and to apply it? I don't know. It might be. You also make a good kind of preliminary argument about that in your paper that I read before our conversation, which is called A Relativity Theory about Attention and Language Towards AI Singularity and Age-Friendly Robotics Usability in the Internet of People, Places, and Things. So you make a good argument for that. Of course, the proof is in the pudding. So we need a lot more data. We need a lot more applicability, and we need sort of applied theory to be able to say, okay, this is our foundational hypothesis. This is how we thought we're going to apply it, and this is the result. And then we can say, well, does this result verify or deny our starting hypothesis? And then again, the starting hypothesis may be correct. Maybe we just need a little tweak or fine-tuning of the specific phrase that we use to apply it. So I can say that from where I stand and from my kind of limited knowledge and ability to kind of assess in this field, it looks as a very interesting project that's worth pursuing, and I'll be very curious to find out when you have the first results and as you progress forward.
Thanks very much for your kind words. For the record, we never spoke with each other. That's actually the first time we're meeting. But I totally agree with you in terms of the preliminary character of my results. I think it's a starting point to investigate this topic further. Indeed, what I haven't yet documented in a written form, as you find it right now, is I think there might be the possibility to actually consider to extend this concept of universal grammar to really sorts of a computer programming language where we assume that certain concepts are more explicit than other concepts. Yeah. And about those concepts, we could evolve actually kind of a processing framework. But this is the interesting question, I think, for the future is certainly that it's kind of the intersection of language philosophy and computer science, as we would need to start defining what are kind of semantics that are more hardwired than other semantics. And in that sense, I think it's a starting point eventually. Happy that you respond so positively to it.
And another interesting kind of empirical question would be, how many of those do we have? And I'm sure there's people who have kind of ventured to provide us with an answer, which I don't know because I haven't done enough research in the field. But the number of those kind of universal grammar elements is very important, because that may be the case, and there may be maybe few of them, so that it's insufficient to take it to the level that you're talking about. Or alternatively, if there's a sufficiently high number of them, then you can use that towards the creation of a sort of a universal language. And then, here's another thing, why this is so very important. If what you say is true, okay, that's going to have not only an impact on the AI progress and development and our relationship with them, but it's going to bounce right back, or boomerang right back, and it's going to have direct effect and huge impact on us, because we know that as we start co-evolving with technology, our language changes in order to be able to keep up to date with that technology. And especially the younger generation of people, they don't have any issues kind of making into verbs all those words that didn't exist even in the dictionary just 5 or 10 years ago. Google this, or Twitter that, or Facebook this, etc., etc. So that kind of language that you're proposing would be fundamentally impactful at every level, at the machine level, at how we program and create those machines, at how we create them, at how we design them, and on our own culture, and eventually even between us, how we communicate through each other. Because let's face it, our communication, even as we speak right now, this is a great example, is intermediated by machines. It's intermediated by computers, by technology. It's intermediated by possibly some kind of artificial intelligence. And therefore, the kind of language that's used to program and empower that kind of communication will have direct impact on the communication itself. As Marshall McLuhan says, the medium is the message. So if the medium is artificial intelligence, and if the medium is that new language you're proposing, that eventually will become the message, and it will be not only the wrapper, but to a increasingly greater degree the substance or the essence of that culture.
I'm totally with you. I think as well it's like a co-constructed process that it well shines back onto society, because that moment where we're all starting talking differently about using the internet or the Internet of Things, this moment as well our own behavior changes, influenced by this new kind of syntax that is all of a sudden eventually a standard. On a positive note, I'm kind of technology optimistic that actually a better language could as well create a more positive perception of technologies. And this is even more why I think that like a very children-oriented way, which is like eventually the most peaceful, the most innocent way of communicating, because it's without any kind of bias, without any kind of presumptions, could actually help to create a more positive perception of technologies as interface for society.
Now, we got to be careful there. There's always some kind of bias. But yeah. So bias is unavoidable. The thing is, we have to, we can actually take it into account as long as we are aware of what kind of bias it is. So, for example, when we're talking about children-like communication, obviously, one among the major biases is simplicity. Right? Yeah. We don't have the richness of communication, the richness of the vocabulary. So we have a bias for simplicity. That's perfectly fine. There may be, however, some situations or issues arising from that kind of bias. So we should be aware of that. And going back to your previous statement that you said that we actually haven't communicated before today. That's absolutely true. And I even want to say for the record that the first time when you approached me with your idea, I didn't quite get it. I was in the middle of a bunch of other things. I get hundreds of emails and stuff, and I didn't quite get it. Now that actually I did have a little bit of time to invest into kind of educating myself, going into the idea how you came up about it, and reading your paper and watching your PowerPoint presentation, it kind of makes sense to me very much. And I think, I just wanted to say that for the record.
Thanks very much. I can assure you, you're not the first person that is saying I didn't get what you want in the first place. And I think that's the beauty and the tragedy of new ideas at the same time, because if you're trying to describe something that no one ever else has seen before, then you sometimes you're playing with ways of explaining it and describing it. And similar to like Einstein said, maybe play is the highest form of research. As well, linking back to this discourse of like children, how the children learn. I think that's the only way of creating ideas is actually playing with them. And the more I'm happy that you found the time and the interest to having a chat. Very, it's great feedback. Thanks a lot.
Oh, you're very welcome. And that's kind of a key issue, by the way, with all ideas, because ideas that spread win. And to make an idea spread, you have to communicate that idea as widely as possible. And to communicate that idea successfully, you have to find the right language to do so with people, and so that they can find the right associations in themselves to get it. And so that's crucial. Again, ideas that spread win.
That's I can certainly see where you're coming from, and I think that links as well closely to this topic of attentionalism, attention economy. The question is, how do you gain attention in a world where we all know the same? And maybe let me use this speaking point for another hypothesis. I have the hypothesis that the amount of good ideas is limited. The amount of good ideas is limited because if we assume that we all know the same in a zero marginal cost society, then it's the only, if new ideas equal given knowledge plus multiplied with the times of combinations, then is the amount of ideas limited by the times we can combine them. So ideas are limited at every point in time. The interesting thing, I believe, in terms of singularity is, what do you think we're going to see first? Will it be like the economic singularity where we see like the emergence of business models? Will it be like the technology singularity? Where do you see are we going in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years? What will happen next, and what will have the bigger impact?
Well, I mean, to be able even to make the distinction between the economic singularity and the technological singularity, we have to be very careful again with the language. So it's very good to define what we mean by each. So now for the economic singularity, as far as I'm concerned, that will be the moment when robots end up doing the vast majority of jobs in the world. Let's say 50% plus one of all the jobs in the world start to be done by robots, and not limited only to, let's say, blue collar jobs, but also intellectual jobs, jobs that were previously done by highly qualified and highly paid, highly educated people, such as doctors and lawyers, for example, not only cab drivers or miners and manual laborers and construction workers, right? So that's for me what I would call the economic singularity. And I think it absolutely, definitely is happening already. We're in the early stages of it. I would give it another 5, 7, 8 years, maybe 10 tops, and that will be a reality in my opinion. I mean, just look at it. Foxconn already is replacing 1 million workers with 1 million robots. And of course, let's be specific and honest here. The worst countries here, there used to be sort of a manufacturing migration from the first world into the third world. So now the vast majority of the economy, perhaps in places like North America and so on, is done in the service sector, but the actual manufacturing is exported to Asia, China, India, Vietnam, etc. Now, those countries such as China will be the worst hit in a situation where you have robots replacing humans. Why? Because they have the largest manufacturing sector percentage-wise in terms of their global economy, and they have already gained as much as possible from sort of employing that labor, and now the only way they can kind of increase productivity is if they remove labor totally out of the equation, and that's what's happening. So places like India, China, Vietnam, and so on, highly sort of manufacturing-oriented countries would suffer the most and first. So that's going to be not only an economic issue, but it will be a political and social issue, especially for them. Because for us here, it doesn't make a difference whether it's a million Chinese people or a million Chinese robot that produce my iPhone. But for them there, that makes all the difference, because those million Chinese people would not be able to send money to their parents in the country. They will not be able to buy or hope for a better life. They would not be lifted out of poverty. And consequently, possibly, there may be social and even political upheaval, right? So definitely, in my opinion, the economic singularity is on the way, and it's much closer. And in a way, it's the one that worries me the more. Why? Because, and let's go a step further back and just define for a moment what the technological singularity is. The technological singularity, very crudely put, will be the moment when machines equal or get better than human intelligence. So, and then the question is, what happens to us, and so on. Are we going to be able to survive or not? So, the economic singularity, in a way, is a subset of the technological singularity, because machines would equal and do better than humans in the manufacturing and in all the sort of productive employment, job growth, industry parts of the economy. So any economic activity, or the vast majority of the economic activity, will be conducted by robots. That's the economic singularity. Whereas the technological singularity takes that to the level of intelligence, artificial general intelligence. That's to be able to do not only one specific task, like, for example, to weld the door of a Tesla car, or to produce a microchip, but anything else that the human can do, including creative pursuits like music, art, or intellectual pursuits like medical diagnosis or legal advice, etc. So now, if we have a substantial social and political upheaval in the economic singularity, that can kind of tip over or create a certain momentum that's not going in a good direction towards the technological singularity, because it can lead to a lot of conflict, including violent conflict, revolution, protests, etc. And you know, there may be, for example, a new kind of Luddite based terrorism designed to blow out and destroy the new robotized factories, just like the classic Luddites tried to do in 17th, 18th century England during the original Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And that in turn can create an environment in which we are so polarized and so kind of at each other's throats on the one hand, and on the other hand can waste so many resources and attention and energy that we are unprepared for the bigger issue, which will be the technological singularity. And therefore, if we don't get the economic singularity right, we can totally have higher probability to mess up the technological singularity. Now, what's the good news? The good news is that if we get the economic singularity, it goes both ways. If we get the economic singularity right, then we could have much bigger economic surplus power, intellectual time, and resources to address and approach the technological singularity in the best possible way. So it's kind of all about how the economic singularity is going to play out, in my view, right? Is it going to lead to conflict and revolution and bloody disaster where a few people control the means of production and are able to set everything in the world? Or is there going to be some kind of guaranteed minimum income or some kind of minimum standard of living at the very least, which is going to create a little bit more egalitarian dissemination of the benefits of that robotization, and we, to the degree that we no longer need to work, but we can freely engage in creative activities of our own choosing to the best of our ability, to the best of our interest, and to the best of our societies.
Do I understand you right, that you're saying that probably the economic singularity is easier to achieve because those processes that are actually remaining as the economic surplus of our socio-economic interaction are easier to replace by standardized processes? And now you mentioned like production industries, like in Asia, for instance. I'm thinking, for instance, of Germany, where we have a lot of accounting departments. And I know small companies that have like 15% of their staff only in the accounting department. And I already know technologies today that easily can replace all of them at once.
Absolutely. That's already happening.
Yeah.
In many places, many of those people who are not blue-collar works, but were very well paid off people, like, for example, in the legal and or accounting departments, that in bigger companies used to take hundreds of people, now are shrunk by a factor of 10 or 15, and you have just a few people in charge, but mostly it's smart algorithms and things like that. And those few people are mostly doing support or trying to ensure that we are running the right algorithms and the right optimization sort of processes and stuff like that. So definitely going to happen, and is already happening, not only in Germany, but across the world.
Is it then as well in the political interest of actually finding strategies how to address this problem? Because it's something like a principal agent problem, as it feels to me, because indeed no one is interested in being replaced by an algorithm if it puts my own job at risk. But still, as you explained, it's like of our interest as a society of actually finding good ways to deal with singularity in order to actually advance technologies in a sustainable way. So
that's the difference between the two singularities, the economic and the technological. The technological singularity, we have the technology to already, the economic singularity, we already have the technological foundation to make it happen. It's already unfolding. It's already happening. So the problem then is ethical and political. It's one of having the right ethical sort of framework, and as well as the political will to push forward and adapt or adopt that right framework to minimize suffering, to minimize disruption, to minimize social upheaval, and hopefully violent opposition and stuff like that. So that's the smaller problem. The technological singularity, on the other hand, is a bigger problem, because in addition to eventually presenting itself as an ethical and legal and political issue, it's also a technological issue. We don't know yet how to create artificial intelligences, but if and when we discover, the way we get there will be very important towards the kind of singularity we're going to have. That's why I said that the language that we are going to design those AIs will be vitally important to what they can do, how they're going to think, how they're going to look at us, how they're going to look at themselves, how they're going to look at the greater universe is going to be crucially important in that process. The environment within which they would arise too. So, for example, would it be a civilian project with transparency? Would it be open source project? or would it be a sort of an enthusiast kind of amateur project, or would it be a secret government military project? Each one of those would give it a different flavor, and it would have its own biases towards a specific particular direction that our future can move towards afterwards. And that's why, I say, if we don't get the economic singularity right, the technological singularity, we have much lower chance of successfully navigating. And vice versa. If we get the economic singularity right, we'll have better chance to navigate the technological one, even though there's never a guarantee.
Some techno-optimists are proposing that actually, especially virtual reality, augmented reality, can alter the possibilities that we have at hand because it equalizes the perception of reality to that extent that we all of a sudden don't have to fear poverty anymore, because the moment where we're putting on our virtual reality, we all of a sudden everyone having a good lifestyle because we are detached from what we're perceiving now as reality. Is this like an option to bet on that, or is it over optimistic?
I don't buy that, to be honest with you. To me, that sounds like, I don't know. You can start using drugs or opium or whatever, and put yourself in this kind of artificial world where you feel great and you're high and you have these absolutely amazing experiences. But sooner or later, you crash land in the real reality, or at least in our reality, whether it's the real or not. And sooner or later, you have to deal with that. So, yeah, people can escape for a certain time and for a certain place, whether they do it by watching TV or by smoking marijuana or playing video games. Sooner or later, we have to come back to the real world and deal with the problems in the real world.
So it's probably not the most sustainable way to assume such kind of future for AI.
If we have huge problems in the real world, the virtual world is not going to prevent conflict. It's not going to prevent, oppression. It's not going to prevent revolution. It's not going to prevent war. It can alleviate in some cases. It can help us treat some symptoms and address some specific issues. It would give some people a way to escape. I don't think it's going to be to the fundamental level that it would allow us to ignore the real reality.
Yeah, it would be indeed interesting. And I was with the questions I submitted up front. When one was, when do we notice that we are in a singularity or that we have reached singularity? Connecting to your last statement. If I think about technologies like Facebook, or how Facebook in the news feed has been changing how people are consuming media or perceiving the reality, I would almost go that far and would say a couple of wars have been prevented because all of a sudden we're having like a global phenomenon of community where people refrain to go into war because they have like friends in a country nearby and they know about their lives. So maybe we're already on the way there in this moment where we don't have any more this mass media, where we don't have any more television or newspapers that are not relevant, but instead everyone is having like this individualized newsfeed. Maybe we are already walking the direction where such kind of effects are taking place, but certainly still more on a conscious level because you're a consumer of media. But certainly I see some kind of harmonization of thinking. Not sure how to put it.
You have to be careful with that. Yes, there's communication that we didn't have before. Yes, there's therefore some kind of more synchronization.
Yeah, that's fine.
But that means there's also a lot more clash. So people feel a lot more threatened now, whether they're in the Middle East or somewhere else, because they cannot escape the Western world. They cannot escape the Western way of thinking. Not only that, but you also have the foundation for oppression. So, for example, Facebook was used not only by the Syrian government and now in Turkey, just like Twitter and so on, but also many other countries to identify dissent and then to basically send the secret or open government police and to arrest or kill those people. So it's a double-edged sword, just like everything else we do.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. What do you think in the next 10, 20 years, what are the technologies where we notice singularity first? Will it be like natural learning processing, as I'm maybe proposing with my interface syntax? Will it be visual recognition? Will it be artificial humor even? What do you think are the fields where we maybe see the next breakthroughs?
Well, to be honest, based on my conversations with a number of people, as you said, I've done over 200 interviews. If by artificial humans you think you're talking to mind uploads and things like that, I would say that's the least likely scenario from what I've seen so far. In other words, we are the furthest away from that goalpost because we still are very far from understanding the human brain. And just to give you an example, we've done complete neural mapping of the C. elegans worms for probably 35 years now. We've had that since the 1980s. If I remember, it's like 272 neurons or something like that, very small compared to our 80 or 100 billion neurons. And we still have absolutely no idea how those work and how to kind of emulate that or simulate that. So if we can't do it with 270 neurons, what's the chance we can do it with 100 billion? And then, of course, you have not only an order of magnitude difference in terms of scale, but also the fact that quantitative changes or accumulation leads to qualitative changes at certain levels. In other words, it's not just scaling from the neural mapping of a worm to a human, but there's a lot more complicated stuff happening here. So I think that's the least likely path that we're going to see, or at least right now we're the furthest away from it. Now, the two things that we have to get right to get AI would be definitely vision software, artificial vision, kind of working artificial vision, where a computer can identify any object from any media as good or better and as fast or better than human.
So beyond pattern matching, really like an interpretation of what is the context that the vision is right now observing, whether it's a bird or it's a drone or whether it's an airplane, beyond interpretation beyond the visible.
And not just that, but anything related to the image. Let's say, for example, you have a painting by Picasso. And let's say it's a bird or it's sunflowers. Well, the important thing in some cases, in some context, so it connects again to your language. In some context, the sunflowers may be important, but in other contexts, it doesn't matter what the painting is of, as long as it has the signature of Van Gogh, if it's sunflowers, or if it's a bird Picasso, or something like that. And in other contexts, what would make a difference will be whether it's an impressionist or a cubist, or whether it's from the orange period or the blue period. In other words, everything that the human can extract from that image as an information in a very limited, with a single glance almost, right? So if you're an expert on Picasso or on Van Gogh, you take a glance at the painting for like 1 second or 2 seconds, and then you can close your eyes and you can speak for 2 hours at least about what you saw there, right? From which period it is, what does it say about the author, is it original likely or not, what's the image of, what his mood was, or what kind of paint he was using, all that kind of information. And each one may be irrelevant or relevant depending on the context of the conversation that we're having at that time. So that's the sort of vision bar requirements that the machine has to pass to equal or better. And it has to be able to do it also at the same time frame that we are doing it. I think that's also coming, and I think that's actually the likelier scenario. I gave you already the unlikely one, and then combine that vision with breakthroughs in smart learning algorithms, like, for example, the ones implemented by Deep Blue trying to play Go, and or a new kind of universal, I don't know what you want to call it, programming language, using sort of hardwired basic grammar that you suggest spans across cultures and generations. And then you definitely, I think you have the recipe for artificial intelligence. Now, when would each of those breakthroughs come? I don't know, but it looks like we're making progress, fast progress on each of those constantly. And if I were to venture to say, I would say 5-10 years, we would have either done it, or we would be very close to doing it in the worst case scenario. Whereas the alternative approach with mind uploading, I don't think it's anywhere close to for the next 10 years. We're still very far away from there.
I think all those recent researches that have been done in terms of how the brain is constituted and how memory is constitutes in the brain, I think it's primary about understanding concepts of functioning principles of our thinking in order to easier translate them into algorithms. But I agree with you, it certainly is going to take some time longer until we actually can use a link between machines in our own biology to infuse information or data, or to alternate memories even. I agree it will take probably way longer than we would expect. Yeah. One other thought that I had while you were explaining your vision, I think what might be an interesting field to investigate is actually if we can come up beyond this universal grammar, as well maybe with like universal thought models, which describe dependencies of actions. If we had like universal models, how and that was the first thought, and it's out into the blue. But if we had a universal model of how a war is like constituted, what kind of actions leading to it, we could basically train machines to understand it. And if we had this kind of models for a couple of standard situations, and you could have it for like relationships, for like jobs, for like events, that we find like a standard model of events that need to play together in order to see events happening.
This is where I'm kind of becoming a little bit more skeptical, because I'm willing to grant that there is some evidence to suggest that there may be such thing as universal grammar as based on the work of Noam Chomsky. I am not willing to do the next one up and say that there's a universal thought process necessarily. So to the degree that there's a universal grammar in that specific realm, there will be a universal thought process at the low level. However, thought process again is happening in language, and to have sophisticated thought process, you need sophisticated language. Each language has its biases, its presumptions, its shortcuts, and therefore the thought process of a German is very different than the thought process of, a Mandarin speaker or a Swahili speaker, and the logic, the thinking itself is different because it's in a different language. It's just like the way that things happen in Linux and Mac OS and Windows, but maybe even more different than that. Right? Each operating system, if the language is the operating system of the brain, each operating system has its biases, its shortcuts, its abbreviations, its presumptions. And it carries that within its kind of logic, and it suffers for it in a way. It's dangerous because it's not the right way. It's the right way in this context of that language or that operating system.
So maybe there would be a way, or it's an idea once again. One of my hypotheses is that jokes and violence or hate are like the strongest possible opinions in any kind of language or any kind of culture.
Yeah, but jokes don't translate well into different cultures. What's funny in one culture may not be funny for a different culture, and vice versa.
Exactly, I totally agree. But maybe the more important it would be if we would find like for war, it's like easy. It's like the worst thing that can happen that is solved. But maybe it would be interesting for artificial intelligence to say, if we find a universal concept for humor that works across any kind of language, that we could see the actually kind of thought patterns dissolved.
Mm-hmm.
But it's certainly a steep hypothesis and a fun one, maybe because as well of the topic of humor.
Yeah, I'm always willing to consider that as a possibility. I myself would be inclined to be skeptical that we can find a universal way of doing humor, because what's so unique about humor or poetry or art or music is that it's so unique, it's so different. And yes, with music, it's probably, I think we have gotten the closest with music.
I think in music there are a couple of recent results that actually speak about the perfect melody.
Yes. With music we have gotten closer to it, so maybe music would be more inclined to that kind of assault. But humor to me would be much toughest, and I think actually humor is in a way the highest level of intelligence, because in a situation where you cannot, because humor allows you to convey an idea to a party that's intellectually unassailable. So let's say you have two interlocutors where from a radically different background, whether politically or socially or culturally or otherwise, and one party tries to make a very straightforward logical argument to the other. It rarely, the communication almost never happens. It breaks down somewhere. And I mean, we can look at the presidential elections right now, or anywhere that we have extreme polarization, we can observe that phenomenon. And yet humor is one of those incredible things which can go across those boundaries, and is kind of like a Trojan horse, if you will, where intellectual assault is unable to penetrate, humor is. And so in that way, I think humor is actually much more powerful than straightforward logic and intellectual prowess. And therefore, it's the highest form of intelligence, perhaps.
It's great to have the chat with you. Indeed, the part of this final paper manuscript that I'm writing deals with humor about, in one conclusion, a preliminary conclusion. It's not a paper about humor itself, but the preliminary conclusion is that we all have to get better at telling jokes, because the logic behind it's kind of a fun logic. The logic is if humor equals tragedy plus time, then tragedy is easy to create, but humor is actually the higher level of abstraction. And it's similar, as you were saying, with the US elections, for instance. There we can see how actually this polarization is taking place at this intersection of like being very mean to other people and being funny at the same time. But certainly becoming better and telling jokes is better than being mean to other people. So in that sense, I totally agree with you.
And I was also meaning to say that, or to convey the idea that you can sneak in ideas wrapped in humor that the other side would fail to consider or appreciate if they're just pure logic and intellect. But when you wrap them up in humor, people take their guard down, and then it's like a seed that sinks in, and then it can plant into a big tree eventually, you know? Humor is able to penetrate that kind of armor.
Very interesting. It's a very interesting and very nice note indeed for the end of our small chat. Thanks so much for your time. It's much appreciated. And certainly I will do let you know what I make out of it and how I'm going to pursue with the paper and when it's going to be published. But I can guarantee that certainly your remarks will find a very well-suited place in this manuscript. And thanks a lot for your time, Nikola.
My pleasure, Tobias, and I hope I was helpful as much as I possibly can.
It was super. Much better. No, I couldn't think of any better way of